Yo, what's going on, y'all? It's Cone back here again today with another video, and today I want to talk for a bit about the Oklahoma City Thunder. I've made a lot of videos talking about how good they are this season on the channel already. I mean, can you blame me? They're ridiculous and they're my favorite team. But today I instead want to focus on how they got to this point, how they became the Juggernauts, the team that's currently on pace for 58 wins as one of the 4 youngest teams in the entire association. It's something that doesn't make sense. The turnaround that they've had from beginning of the rebuild till now is extraordinary. It is one of the fastest rebuilds up to championship contender level that I've truly ever seen. And I'm not just saying this as a Thunder fan. I really can't think of many better examples of doing this, especially in a case where they didn't bring in like any big name free agents. It's not like where Cleveland brought back LeBron James to save the franchise. They did this all in-house. Sam Presti, the rest of the front office have just worked miracles. And when you talk about rebuilds, this is an example of a near flawless one. I don't think any rebuild is truly flawless. I mean, the Thunder have definitely made some mistakes here and there, but for the most part, this is a near perfect rebuild and one that has the Thunder looking like a championship contender just a few years after the whole thing started. So let's talk about how this whole thing went. Back in 2019, the Thunder traded away Russell Westbrook and Paul George. Russ had been there for his entire career. It felt like he might be a Thunder lifer, but it just reached a point where the team really wasn't competing. So they said, okay, Russ, we'll trade you somewhere where you can try and compete for a championship. And that spot was Houston. Send him over there in exchange for Chris Paul, who at that point's contract was looked at as an albatross. And they received 4 first-round picks. That's 2 pick swaps and 2 actual picks in exchange for Russell Westbrook. And then there was the blockbuster deal of the entire summer, one of the biggest trades of all time, when they sent Paul George over to the Los Angeles Clippers in exchange for Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Danilo Gallinari, and a record-setting number of draft picks. A lot of people thought this would be the true beginning of the rebuild, that the Thunder were going to be really bad that season, trade away Chris Paul at some point during the year, Gallinari, and maybe some of the other guys, but instead, the Thunder shocked the world. They made the playoffs, faced off against the Houston Rockets, the very team they traded Russell Westbrook to in the playoffs, lost in 7 games in the bubble, and had an amazing season. One of my favorite Thunder seasons of all time. I made a full video recapping that. If you want to go check it out, it's here on the channel somewhere. But that was the end of that era, and the Thunder really tore it down in the 2020 offseason when they traded away Chris Paul over to the Phoenix Suns, Gallinari to the Hawks, Schroeder over to the Lakers, and Steven Adams to the New Orleans Pelicans. To me, this was the true beginning of the rebuild. This is when the Thunder flipped the switch from trying to compete in some way to saying, okay, we're going to just get a good draft pick and try and prioritize the youth. And the young core looks way different then than it did now. There was Shane Dort, the only 2 guys remaining from this young group of guys, and then there was like Darius Bazley, Hamidou Diallo, Teo Maledon, Alexei Pokusevski, Isaiah Roby. Those were some of the key guys in that group going into the season. That team was also weird because they had a couple of veterans in Al Horford and George Hill. Horford would end up getting shut down halfway through the season before being sent to Boston in the offseason, and George Hill was traded to the Sixers right around the trade deadline that year. So that was the 2021 season. That year they won 22 games, the lowest point of the rebuild. Next year, 24 wins, a 2-win improvement, 16-win improvement the next year up to 40 wins, go to the play-in tournament, beat the New Orleans Pelicans in a really hard-fought game before falling to the Timberwolves, coming just a win short of making the playoffs after winning 24 games the year prior. And now they're a team that is on pace for, again, 58 wins. They've got an outside shot at even hitting 60 if they really turn it up over the rest of the stretch. And they've got one of the easier schedules. So if they hit 60, I wouldn't even be surprised. And if they had just made the jump from a playing team last year to this team now, it would be impressive in its own right. But when you take into account that just a couple of seasons ago, they won 24 games, they won 22 the year before that, and the beginning of that season where they won 22 games was not even 3.5 years ago, it was 40 months. 40 months ago that they were at that low point, the beginning of the rebuild till now, it shouldn't even be possible to make a team this good in that time frame. I feel like it really gets put into perspective when we take a look at some of the other teams that started rebuilding right around when the Thunder did. Take, for example, the Houston Rockets. That same offseason that the Thunder really blew things up, they traded Russell Westbrook away to the Wizards, and through the first few games of the season, ended up trading James Harden to the Brooklyn Nets for a crazy package. So they went into the rebuild the same season that the Thunder really did, and you flash forward to now, and they've definitely made some progress, but they're nowhere near where the Thunder are, and honestly, that's okay. The Rockets are looking a lot better. They've got this defensive identity. They've got great players like Alperen Sengun, for example. They've got Jabari Smith Jr. I think Amin Thompson's going to be special. Like, I think they've got a really good thing brewing over there in Houston. They're just pretty far behind Oklahoma City, and that's completely okay. That's more of a normal timeline for rebuild than what the Thunder are doing at the moment. The Pistons made the playoffs in 2019 with a 500 record, and they haven't won more than 23 games since, despite having a number 1 overall pick in that stretch in Cade Cunningham, and having 3 top 7 picks over the last few years. There's also the Orlando Magic, who traded Nikola Vucevic at the deadline in 2021, as well as Aaron Gordon, Evan Fournier, kind of the key pieces they had for a while, so they started the rebuild like half a season after the Thunder, but they're still decently far behind. They are looking a lot better this season. I think they're probably going to make the playoffs. At the very least, they'll be a play-in team, and maybe this is their play-in season like the Thunder had last season before making that big jump next year, but the Thunder are clearly the better squad at the moment. And again, that's not a knock on the Magic. I think they're doing an amazing thing over there, and Franz and Powell are going to be one of the best duos in the league for years to come. It just goes to show how quickly the Thunder really turned this thing around, becoming one of the best teams in the NBA way quicker than any of these other rebuilding teams have managed to pull off in a while. So the question is, how did they get to this point? How did they rebuild so quickly? One of the big things to me is that the Thunder didn't waste any time. They saw that the Russ Paul George thing was not working, and there was reports afterwards that they weren't super happy in Oklahoma City. Neither one of them made like a public trade request, but Paul George specifically kind of made it known that he wanted to be moved. Russell Westbrook said, hey, I wouldn't be opposed to it, and so they were like, hey, we're not winning, we're not going to force this thing, we're going to blow it up, and that allowed them to capitalize on the great trade market they had for those two guys, the Clippers' desperation to get Paul George to bring in Kawhi Leonard, the fact that Chris Paul didn't have a lot of value, they took on his contract as well as draft picks, and ended up being good, which allowed them to get a further return on him. It was the perfect timing to go ahead and blow it up. A lot of GMs would have stuck that thing out for a lot longer. You think about where Chicago is at the moment, where they refuse to trade DeMar DeRozan, Zach LaVine. They're trying to live off the magic of something that happened a couple of years ago that's not going to repeat itself. That's a really stubborn franchise, and they could have started this rebuild at this past deadline, the one before that, the offseason before that. They've had so many chances, but they're still sticking this out, and it's going to cost them a lot of time. The Wizards did that for years before they eventually ended up really committing to it this season, and I think that was a great call on their part. Brooklyn right now is doing this, where I think they should have went ahead and traded guys at this deadline, but instead they're trying to run things continuously with Mikal Bridges as the centerpiece. They're star hunting potentially in this offseason. I just think they're delaying the inevitable. They're a different case a little bit because they don't own their own draft pick right now and don't own a lot of their future draft picks, but I still do think they're an example of kind of just dragging their heels. Another thing the Thunder did was draft really, really well. In this whole thing, the only top 5 pick that they got was to land Chet Holmgren, and he made a lot of sense at that point. To me, he was always the pick. He was my favorite player in the process, but there could have been a possibility they could have taken like a Jabari Smith Jr. He was rumored to go to the Magic at 1 all the way up until draft day. Some mocks had him going to Oklahoma City at some points, but the Thunder stuck with their guy in Chet at number 2 and made the right pick because he's been amazing so far. Then you've got Jalen Williams, who they picked up at pick 12, using the Clippers pick that they got back in that Shai Paul George deal, and picking him up there was a huge success. Apparently, there are a lot of teams also really interested in taking him, maybe even trading up with the Knicks at 11 to land him, and so the Thunder said, no, we're not going to let anyone else have him, and they themselves traded for pick 11, keeping pick 12 in the process to let themselves get Ousmane Dieng as well, who hasn't developed quite yet, but he's shown a lot of flashes, and just by trading up to make sure nobody else could land Jalen Williams, they made sure they got him as well. So that was a massive draft haul, and right now, the second and third best players on the roster are Chet and Jada, both of whom I think are future All-Stars, maybe even future All-NBA players, and they got them in the same draft lottery. Also in that same draft, they got Jalen Williams out of Arkansas at the 34th pick, who's been our backup big a lot of the season and has been really effective. Back in 2021 at pick 55, right before the end of the draft, they got Aaron Wiggins, who's one of the best role players on the entire roster. That's immense value at the back half of the draft. They got Cason Wallace this year, trading up to pick 10 with Dallas, and he's been a seamless fit, giving us great guard play off the bench as one of the most efficient shooters in the entire NBA. For the most part, it's been a masterclass in drafting over the past few years. The Thunder did make some mistakes along the way, particularly towards the beginning of this whole process. Like, Trey Mann didn't end up working out great. I still think he can have a great career over in Charlotte. It just didn't end up working out in Oklahoma City. Trading away pieces to go ahead and add Pokusevski obviously did not end up working. Also, now over in Charlotte, for some reason, the Hornets keep signing former Thunder draft picks. Josh Giddey's up in the air right now, mainly in terms of fit. I think he could be good somewhere else, and he's given us a couple of good seasons. I'm just not sure about his long-term fit, so that could end up being a miss. But they hit on enough that the misses don't really matter, and that's part of the appeal of getting a bunch of draft picks, giving yourselves a bunch of swings in the draft, and maximizing your opportunity to hit rather than miss. Which brings us to the big thing that everybody talks about with this Thunder rebuild, and that's draft picks. There are a million memes about how Sam Presti loves his draft picks, and it's true, the Thunder found a way to accrue more draft picks than anybody had ever had at the beginning of the rebuild. And there's a lot of reasons. Like I said, it gives you extra chances. You're going to just swing and miss on prospects all the time. There are guys who can seem like surefire hits, like for example, Markelle Fultz a few years ago, and then freak things happen and all of a sudden he's a bust. You can't really expect that stuff. So if you give yourself a bunch of opportunities with all these draft picks, you give yourself a bunch of chances to hopefully get something right. The draft picks can also act as trade chips. A lot of the biggest trades that we've seen happen in the past few years, like Kevin Durant to the Suns, Rudy Gobert to the Wolves, Mitchell to the Cavs, etc., have involved a bunch of draft picks. That's the currency of the NBA at this point. So having all those allows yourself to continuously be in those conversations. If a superstar player becomes available and you want to be the team that lands that big fish, you've got a better package than most other teams. Also, if you just want to upgrade on the edges, like say you want to bring in a solid supporting piece rather than a star, a player or two and a first-round pick, or you have a billion of them, so maybe 3 first-round picks to just overpay and guarantee you get your guy is easily possible. One last reason why I think having all these draft picks is really important, and it's something I don't see enough people talk about, is that with these picks, going forward to 2025 and 2027, years down the line, you can have the ability to continue to bring in an influx of young, cheap talent to support this team, because the Thunder are at some point going to have to pay Shai. Well, they already are, but they're going to have to pay him way more. Chet, Jalen Williams, anybody else, a bunch of role players on this team that have been really good are going to have to get paychecks at some point. When you're paying all those guys, you're going to get really high up into the luxury tax or just beyond the salary cap. And with the new CBA, there is big time limitations if you go too far into that cap. So having draft picks to bring in guys that can compete and play on cheap contracts to support those star players who are making $1 billion is important. I think that's a huge luxury to have. And the Thunder have all these options at their disposal with still so many draft picks remaining, and they're already this good. They've hardly tapped into the war chest, and they're already one of the best teams in the NBA with so many options at their fingertips. Sam Presti and the front office have also had an amazing eye for talent over this whole process, like bringing in Isaiah Joe, who was cut straight up by the Philadelphia 76ers and has now become an integral part to the rotation and one of the better three-point shooters in the league. Kenrich Williams was somewhat of an afterthought in the whole Steven Adams trade years ago, but has been integral to the team's success as well as a great wing and even sometimes a backup big for us. Lou Dort was signed as an undrafted free agent in the first place, given some run in his rookie season while the Thunder were actively trying to compete, and eventually became a key part of this team as a great 3-and-D player now. Presti even had an eye for talent with the head coach, bringing in Mark Daigneault, elevating him from the G League squad when he was kind of an unknown to the general public after Billy Donovan left. A lot of people after we signed him were like, who is this guy? Is he just going to be a transitional coach that's just here through the rebuild and not actually here when we're competing? But Mark Daigneault has quickly become one of the best coaches in the league, and I'm pretty sure he's going to win Coach of the Year this year as a guy who, again, was relatively unknown before he started with OKC the past few years. And last but not least, to get to this point, the Thunder had to get lucky. Every single team that has ever made it to a championship, that has competed in any significant way, really any team built in sports, has a little bit of luck involved. It's just the nature of the game, mainly with player progression. When you make these big trades like the Thunder have over the course of the past couple of years, things are going to have to fall your way at some point if you want to compete. And one of the biggest examples is trading for Shai as a rookie. They probably saw signs of greatness. Doc Rivers claims that he saw he was going to be an all-star, all-NBA player as a coach. They really did not want to trade him away. Sam Presti refused to make the deal without him and ended up landing him. So clearly he saw some greatness in him, but there was no guarantee he was going to turn into an all-NBA first teamer twice after this season and a future MVP most likely. That's stuff that very few players have ever done. Even me as the biggest Shai fan in the world, I thought he was eventually going to be a future MVP and could be the franchise guy, but there was never a guarantee. Shai just worked really hard, they committed to him, and it ended up working out. And some of that is, scouting, talent recognition, and player development, but there's definitely some luck involved. You could also say the Thunder got a little bit lucky with how rapidly J-Dub and Chet have ascended. Chet in his rookie season has become one of the league's better bigs, one of the better rim protectors, a great stretch big, someone that plays extremely well off of Shai and competes at a high level already. Jalen Williams, who was taken outside the top 10, a lot of teams passed on him, clearly was a mistake. He has already become a borderline all-star player as our second option and is doing some ridiculous things on any given night as one of the most efficient players in the entire NBA as a sophomore. Obviously, a lot of this is just talent recognition and scouting, but there is some aspect of luck that they're this good this quickly. But even with some of the luck-based stuff, the Thunder were able to manipulate the odds in their favor. For example, it was certainly fortunate timing that the Paul George trade popped up when it did. At that moment, the Clippers desperately needed Paul George to land Kawhi Leonard, otherwise he wasn't coming. Maybe he would go over to the Lakers or stay with Toronto, just had to get Paul George if they wanted him in a Clipper uniform. And the Thunder saw this, utilized their leverage to get the most out of the Clippers, and at the same time, even went to the Raptors and said, hey, we could trade you Paul George and Russell Westbrook if you want to remain competitive, and maybe that convinces Kawhi Leonard to stay, which would be a nightmare for the Clippers. So they built up as much leverage as possible, got the most of that they could have out of that deal to maximize their return on investment with the PG trade. Now we fast forward to today, and after all this, the Thunder are one of the youngest teams in the league. They're elite, and they still have so many assets at their disposal between draft picks and cap space. They have so much cap space this summer. They're probably not going to sign a free agent. They really never do. But if they want to go big fish hunting, add a guy with a big time contract, they've got a slot that can fit into seamlessly. Or if they just want to add a couple of pieces on the edges, they've got so much flexibility. Now it's just all about executing what the Thunder have built up to this point. Trying to win a championship, didn't manage to do it with the Russ, KD, Harden era, but I don't see the Thunder front office making the same mistakes they did that time where they traded away James Harden, they broke up the trio before they could really compete at the highest level. Right now they've already built a better supporting cast than probably any of the Russ and KD teams ever had right now with this squad. Shooters surrounding them like Isaiah Joe, Cason Wallace, Aaron Wiggins, Kenrich Williams is out there too. They've built up a fantastic squad. Lou Dort too is a 3-and-D guy. This is a supporting cast that those past Thunder teams never had, so they've clearly learned from their mistakes. They've given themselves assets to manipulate the roster they need to compete. The Thunder are in one of the best positions, maybe the single best position out of anybody in the entire NBA, and they just started the rebuild about 40 months ago. But with all that being said, that's pretty much the Thunder rebuild in a nutshell. What's been great about it, a couple mistakes that they've made, and why they are where they are at this moment. It's been a wild ride to witness as a Thunder fan. I can't wait to see what they do in the playoffs this year. This team right now is probably my favorite Thunder team of all time. They've shattered my expectations, and I think they're going to continue to do that over the next few years with one of the brightest both presents and futures in the entire NBA. Let me know what you think about this Thunder rebuild down below in the comments. What other great rebuilds have you seen? How far do you think the Thunder can go this season? And do you think they managed to win a championship with the group they have right here at the moment? I appreciate y'all watching. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. I'll see y'all later. Real one, safe back.